Over in Daniel, it says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people to make an end of sins, to bring an everlasting righteousness, etc., etc. So when Jesus came in 27 AD, there were only 7 years left on the Jewish probation. And so now Jesus is dealing with his church. He had given them a commission and they had failed. So here we are in Matthew, the 9th chapter, and I want you to understand. He started his ministry. The Bible says, and Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. Here we see Jesus is among his people. He's going through all the synagogues. He's preaching and teaching and healing. Let's continue now. Now he's among his people. Verse 36, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Here Jesus is among his own people. He had compassion upon them because they fainted and moved about as sheep without a shepherd. Now he's among his people. Verse 37, then said he unto his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Now we have misapplied this text to mean that the harvest is plenteous out there in the world. This is not what this text is saying. This text is saying that the harvest truly is plenteous on the inside of the church. Plenteous for who? For those wheat, for those tares that have been brought in by default, and they're tares by default, but some of them could be wheat. And so the harvest is truly plenteous on the inside of God's church. So there's a work to do inside the church to help the wheat to see what they really need to do in order to be saved. Are you hearing me, brothers and sisters? Let's continue now. Watch it. So this is not, this is an in text, not an out text. Verse 38, pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. So here Jesus is praying that laborers will come into the harvest on the inside of the church, because on the inside of the church, the people are lost. Let's continue. Let's go to Matthew the 10th chapter now. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Verse 2, then he begins to name the disciples. After he names the disciples, we go down to verse 5. Verse 5 says, these 12, and you need to put your name in the place of those disciples, because God is calling us now. There's a work that you and I have to do. Verse 5 says, these 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles. He said, don't go to the world. He called the 12. He said, look, don't go to the world. Don't go to the Gentiles. And he continues, and into any city of the Samaritans in the United. He said, don't go to the Samaritans. Now, who are the Samaritans? The Samaritans were we'll use the term first cousins of the Jews. They were those people that supposed to worship the same God. They worshiped in the mountain, and they were supposed to have been related to the Jews. Well, today, who would be the Samaritan? Today, the Samaritan would be the first day people. So here God is saying, at this point in time in history, now I want you to understand the point. At this time in history of here, Jesus is saying, don't go to the world. Don't go to the Gentiles. That's people that not worshiping anything. They're just out there in the world. He says, also, don't go to the Samaritans. He says, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Do you understand this, saints? He says, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, there are those at that time that was a part of the Jewish nation. They were lost. And he is sending his disciples to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Today, God is sending forth workers to the lost sheep of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, brothers and sisters. Are you willing to be one of those that will go? And so it becomes very obvious there's no way you're going to work for the lost sheep of the house of Israel on the outside throwing stones. So this is the purpose of this is not to throw stones. Please understand this. Let's see what it says. Verse 7. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So the lost sheep don't know that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. You notice that he didn't say go to the lost tares. He said go to the lost sheep. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Verse 8. Heal the sick. That's so much here. Cleanse the lepers, the leprosy of sin. Raise the dead, the spiritual dead. I hope, brothers and sisters, we can raise the spiritual dead by the grace of God. Cast out devils. That means the lost sheep are possessed of devils. Freely you have received, freely give. Stop going down to verse 16, it says, Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Here God is saying, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. That tells me, brothers and sisters, only sheep, people that have decided they're going to do what God says do, can even do anything to try to rescue others. If you are a terror, if you have a bone to pick, if you are agitated and what have you, then you can't work for God. You have to be a sheep. You have to be humble enough to do this work, brothers and sisters. This is serious, saints. And God is calling us, brothers and sisters, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Let's go back to our screen. She says, you see across the top we see a graph with a W and a T and a W and a T and a W and T. The W represents wheat and the T represents tares. She says, has God no living church? He has a church, but it is the church militant, not the church triumphant. We are sorry that there are defective members, that there are tares amidst the wheat. Let both grow together until the harvest, and in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, gather you together first the tares and bind them in bonds to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So here we see, saints, that God has a church. It is the church militant and not the church triumphant. What do we mean by militant? Militant means there are two opposing influences in God's church today. There are the wheat and tares. So this is his corporate structure. This is his church. She says, but it is the church militant and not the church triumphant. A triumphant church would be a church that consists of only wheat. So here the prophet says, and the Bible says also, Matthew the 13th chapter says, let both grow together until the harvest. So then it becomes critical for you and I to understand, when is the harvest? When will there be only wheat in God's church? And what will happen once there's only wheat in God's church? That's very critical. Remember, we're talking about war on the church. So we see now Satan has brought the tares into the church, but God says, I'm going to purify my church. I'm going to purify it. I'm going to have a pure and clean church that will consist of only wheat. So she says, and the Bible says, let both grow together until the harvest. So then it becomes critical for you and I to know when is the harvest. Now, the Bible says the harvest is the end of the world. So our first thought, if we are not students of the word, that the harvest would be the second coming of Jesus Christ. Well, brothers and sisters, that wouldn't quite work out. And this is the reason it would not work out. We know that prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ, he's already stood up in the most holy place, and he's announced that irrevocable decision, he that is just, let him be just still. He that is filthy, let him be filthy still. And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me to give to every man according as his work should be. So we see that at this point in time, this is the general close of probation for the entire world. So we see at this time, you will be living in the sight of a holy God without a mediator. And so, saints, that means that we will already have had to have victory over sin, because if we sin when Jesus leaves the most holy place, we have no mediator. So we will already have to had victory over sin. But the wheat and the tares won't be together here. They will be separated. So we know that the end of the world is being spoken of here is not the end of the world as in the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we need to see now, when is the harvest? Now, I'm going to recommend something here to you. I have a little book here called The Close of Probation for Seventh-day Adventists. You need to get this little book if you don't have it. The Close of Probation for Seventh-day Adventists. A little booklet that we have put together. Now, let's go to our screen. Now, let's see, when is this harvest? Going to the screen. A new life, she says, is coming from heaven and taking possession of all God's people. But divisions will come in the church. Two parties will be developed. The wheat and the tares grow up together for the harvest. So here we see there are two parties in the church, the wheat and the tares. And there are divisions in the church. All right, going back to our screen. I then saw the third angel, said my accompanying angel, Fearful is his work, awful is his mission. He is the angel that is to select the wheat from the tares and bind and seal or bind the wheat for the heavenly garner. These things should engross the whole mind, the whole attention. So here we see, brothers and sisters, that it is the third angel that is to select the wheat from the tares. Let's go to Revelation, the 14th chapter, Revelation 14, since it is the third angel. Revelation, the 14th chapter. Let's look at verses 9. The Bible says, and the third angel followed them, saying,